percent of our GDP. Canada is the ninth biggest economy, and
Well, it's a bad day for Mark Carney's government as more revelations come forward of the mismanagement of Canadian tax dollars. In addition, the Liberal government admits that Canada has slipped to ninth or 10th place in the global GDP, and they do a 180 on the airline strike. All that and more. Welcome back to the Canadian Shield. My name is Sterling. With every passing day, the Liberal government shows why they're not capable or competent enough to lead the country. Mark Carney was a horrible decision as a prime minister, based completely on his actions of the last 5-6 months. He still doesn't have a constituency office in his riding. That doesn't point to anybody who's committed to the people on the ground, to the people in his riding. I believe he likes to put the word prime minister on his business card, but he doesn't really understand that he's a member of parliament, and he also has constituency issues that he should be dealing with. Probably some of those constituents were very upset when the Liberal government decided to come out and talk tough against the CUPE union over the airline strike. So much so that in 48 hours, the Liberals went from get back to work right now to, oh, we are so happy that you reached a deal and we are going to be doing a probe and an investigation into some of the allegations that you made. You might tell yourself that the fact that they did a 180 is good government, but in reality, it indicates that they have no idea what they are doing. And they are at the whim and the will of whatever mood people happen to be in at the time. Of course, I was always behind the blue collar people of the airline industry, of this particular flight attendant union. The Liberal government came out on the side of corporations, and when channels like mine pointed that out, I believe they got a little bit nervous that their base wasn't going to give them the confidence they required to get through even one session of government. Let's listen to Patty Hadju try to spin the fact that she was saying one thing and then 48 hours she was saying the complete opposite.
I've also heard the allegations of unpaid work. It's unacceptable. Nobody should work for free in this country. In fact, we expect to get paid for the work that we perform. And that's why I've ordered a probe into the allegation of unpaid work in the airline sector. We will start this probe immediately, and if employers are exploiting loopholes in the Canada Labour Code, we'll close them. Nobody should be expected to work for free.
Of course, as of the time of recording, the airline industry miraculously found a way to agree with all of the demands that the union was having, or at least some of them. Now, I didn't really dive too far into what concessions may or may not have been given, and I'm sure there's whole steps in ratification of the contract. It is accepted in principle, and the airlines, the flight attendants have decided to go back to work. Air Canada is announcing that certain flights are resuming, and they're hoping to start to get their international stuff up and running. It should take us a couple of days. First flights are leaving at various airports. These announcements are being made not because they want you and I to be in the public opinion on their team. They don't really care. They're making that because their stock was taking a serious hit. Now, all of a sudden, these people at the top are like, well, this money is impacting my very job, right? Because when the stock takes a hit, the first thing the shareholders say is, who's in charge and how can we replace them? What's the procedure in this particular organization for replacing that individual with somebody who's not going to cost us money? Of course, Mark Carney sent MP Hadju out to try and make everybody think that they had they had this under control the whole time. I mean, I heard her say that she was going to begin a probe in the fall when the House sat again, and now it's like, oh no, we're going to start a probe right away. Of course, that's an absurd. We all know the Liberal government's ability to investigate their friends is basically nothing. They'll quietly say nothing. They'll probably take them a month to hire somebody. Then they're going to have to hire somebody to be in charge of all of the somebodies. Then they're going to have to sit down. It'll take them 6 months to even get started on the entire process. But they want you to believe that they're not the government that they showed themselves to be. And that, I think, is something we have to all look at collectively. Again, I want to reiterate, I don't understand why anybody, no matter what your particular flag that you fly, would think that poverty, mismanagement, and a government that is hypocritical would be the best way forward for your life. You want to give Canada a government like that, and they want more control over your life. So imagine the chaos and the mayhem that they're going to begin to cause as they become desperate to cling to these particular jobs. And I just don't understand why that's a philosophy that some people believe is good for the country or even good for themselves. Case in point, the federal government has been making a big deal the last couple of days that they've been talking to Sweden and they've been talking to Finland. And Anita Anand made a big statement on how she had cracked out a deal with Finland. Melanie Joly, Canada's industry minister, is in Sweden, and then she announced that she's going to Finland because she's going to be talking to them about the shipyard that was purchased. And I'll get into that in a second. First, I want to point out that she's let slip in her press release that Canada has fallen to ninth place. She let slip that Canada has fallen to ninth place in the size of our economy. And I got to thinking how the G7 is the top 7 economies, and now we're ninth. And if you ask some people, we're actually 10th. And of course, here's a list from the Google AI. The United States is $30 trillion. Then comes China at $19 trillion. And I'll come back to that in a second. Then after 19, it just basically drops down to 4, Germany, Japan, India. India has twice the economy of Canada. I mean, we're talking about countries that don't have, Japan doesn't have a single natural resource, and yet they're managing to manufacture things to the point of $4.3 trillion. Canada, by contrast, is number 9 with $2.3 trillion. And I'm reminded how in the G7, the Prime Minister of India was invited to the G7 that was recently in Canada, in Alberta. Perhaps there's a move by the G7 to point out that Canada is really officially no longer part of the G7, and they're going to give the seat of Canada to India. I mean, perhaps that's why the Indian Prime Minister was invited. When you look at the countries on this list, except for China, which I guess has always been excluded primarily because maybe for their politics, you can see that with the exception of India, everybody else was in the room with Trump when he was talking about what was going on in Ukraine with President Zelensky the other day, and how nobody on that list is telling you that we have to include Canada. Because there's some lists that I was looking at that said that Canada and Brazil are actually making Canada 10th, you see, and Brazil is 9th. And so I said, well, let's have a listen to what the Google says, because the AI will run around and get everybody's opinion. And it says that, yes, Brazil's economy is generally considered larger than Canada's. While both countries have significant economies, Brazil's nominal GDP is typically higher than Canada's, making it the larger economy in terms of overall output, according to several financial websites. So what we have here is mismanagement that has dropped Canada at least 2 points on the world stage, probably 3. And we really don't deserve the seat at the G7. We can get into the G20, but we can't get into the G7. Even if we remove China from the process, we're still 8th or 9th, depending on who you ask. Now, the fact that Google AI is saying a bunch of sites are generally considering Brazil to be a stronger economy nominally indicates to me that we are actually 10th. And that Melanie Joly saying 9th is just some kind of wishful thinking. I don't believe that she realizes the significance of saying it off the cuff like that, indicating that in the last 11 years, the Liberal government has taken Canada from being at least a top 7 economy, and now we're barely a top 10 economy. Under the policies and the principles of the far left ideology that is making this country so far down in its economic development that India doubles our output. That's kind of something that we need to consider. Germany doubles our output. So I don't know why they're over there in Finland and Sweden trying to convince you that that's going to offset the trade. I mean, even Mexico is 15th, and they're only like I think 20 billion, 200 billion behind us. So we're talking about a country that's being mismanaged, and what money we are making is leaving the country in droves. Case in point, Melanie Joly's over in Finland talking about how, I'm going to let you hear it.
In Finland, and I've been in contact with the Prime Minister of Finland, and I'll be meeting also with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Defense, and the Minister of the Economy, is because Davy Shipyard from Lévis, Quebec, has acquired Helsinki Shipyard. And it is the first time that a Canadian shipyard in recent history has bought a foreign shipyard. Good news is the Davie shipyard will now be able to have to continue its expansion with shipyard in Helsinki. They bought shipyards also in Texas. This is good news.
I'm sure I just heard Canada's industry minister at the same time as the economy in this country is tanking, at the same time that the Liberals have let our economy slip at least 3 points on the global stage. I'm sure I just heard her say that it was good that this money from the Quebec shipyards is being used to purchase shipyard in Donald Trump's Texas. And I'll get into that in a second. I just want to point out where this shipyard's coming from. And here's a procurement for March 8, 2025, March 8, 2025. Now, if you pay a little bit of attention, you'll see that Mark Carney took over for the Liberal Party on March 9th. National shipbuilding strategy. Let's focus on that. This is their idea to create ships for Canadians and jobs for Canadians. Oh yeah, you can't make it up. Is a long-term commitment to renew the vessel fleets of the Royal Canadian Navy and the Canadian Coast Guard, create a sustainable shipbuilding sector, and generate economic benefit for Canadians. Honorable Jean-Yves Duclos, Minister of Public Services and Procurement and Quebec Lieutenant, announced today that the Government of Canada has awarded a $3.25 billion contract, before tax, like these guys pay any taxes, to Davie Canada Incorporated for the construction of one of the Canadian Coast Guard's future polar icebreakers under the National Shipbuilding Service. This marks a significant milestone in strengthening Canada's Arctic sovereignty and security. Hey, on paper, that sounds all right, right? Like we just gave a $3.25 billion investment into a Canadian ship built by Canadians inside of Canada. We're going to use it for the Coast Guard. Hey, it's wonderful. It's excellent, right? Well, when you look a little bit closer, you find that the money is being shipped out of the country. So in full disclosure, the Liberal government gave $3.25 billion to the Davie shipyard to build the Canadian icebreaker, trying to convince you that this is going to stimulate the economy in Canada. Davie's shipyard had recently purchased, like in 2023, they took over the Helsinki shipyard. And recently, like June of 2025, so they secure this $3.25 billion contract, and then they take that money and they go to Finland in the shipyard in Helsinki, and they buy a steel company in Finland called Enersense Offshore, which is the Enersense Marine and Offshore Unit. So they're buying domestic steel to build ships in Finland. And you think to yourself, well, I mean, there's not too bad of a system there. I'm not done yet. In March of 2025, if you look down, you'll see there, it says, in March of 2025, Helsinki Shipyard signed an agreement with the Canadian government to construct the hull of a heavy icebreaker based on its ready-built Polar Max concept. The steel production for the Polar Max will begin in Pori as soon as possible, with the construction work on the vessel to begin at the Helsinki shipyard in August, which means that they are going to be building the hull of this icebreaker for the Canadian Coast Guard with Canadian tax dollars, with Canadian procurement money in Finland, with Finnish steel and Finnish labor. So I am confused as to why Melanie Joly is trying to convince me that this is a good investment for Canadians. I mean, we gave them $3.25 billion and they took it and they spent it in Finland. We could use those jobs. We could use that money. But they don't seem to care about that. They seem to care more about whether or not they can build these ships in Finland. And the fact that they took $3.25 billion in March and then turned around and purchased a shipyard in Texas in July. Let's have a look at that article. Excuse me, the acquisition happened in June. You can see at the top, 13th of June, 2025. So Donald Trump's in full swing. We gave $3.25 billion to this Quebec company. They went ahead and bought a steel company in Finland, and then they went ahead and bought a shipyard in Donald Trump's Texas, right? With Canadian tax dollars. That seems like a really sound investment by the Liberal government. If we read down a little bit, James Davies, the president and CEO of Davies, said, "We share Gulf Cooper's vision to establish Texas as a world-class center for U.S. icebreaker and complex vessel production. Texas is poised to usher in a new golden age of American shipbuilding, supported by our commitment to delivering vessels on time, on budget, and in line with national security priorities." So that sounds to me like he's taken our, this investment and putting it in Texas, and the Americans are going to be doing well from this money. The hull is going to be built in Finland, and other parts of the ship are going to be built in Texas. I'm not seeing where any of these boats are being built in Canada, though. That's kind of something that's being left off from this little research that Melanie Joly assures Canadians is all about the Canadian national shipbuilding strategy. Now you might think, well, maybe I'm being a little bit too hasty, so let's just read down a couple of articles. Davies already has operations in Quebec, Canada, and in Helsinki, Finland, where approximately 50% of the world's icebreaker fleet has been built. In Finland. Not Canada. Finland. Finland, though they are an Arctic country, they are a little sliver of the Arctic in Canada, but we build them in Finland. It's astounding. The addition of U.S. shipyards would uniquely position them within the Trilateral Icebreaker Collaboration Initiative Pact to rapidly deliver cutting-edge icebreakers to the large scale and competitive cost, countering the heavy subsidized programs of its adversary. Russia, for example, operates a fleet of nearly 50 Arctic-capable icebreakers. 50. Oh, yeah, no, that's great. This is a great expenditure of money. We have one shipyard in Quebec. It's called, it's in Levi, Quebec. It's basically at the mouth of the St. Lawrence, one of the most heavily commercialized waterways in the world, feeding the interior of the North American continent and allowing the interior of the North American continent to send its product to the world. Canada's covered by ice. We cover, a big section of the planet, second largest in the world. So we certainly have the second largest amount of Arctic territory. If the Russians are the largest, they clearly would have, by logic, they would have the largest amount of the Arctic ice, and Canada would have the second largest amount of Arctic ice. But don't worry about it, because we gave $3.25 billion to a Quebec company, and by extension a Canadian company, who immediately took that money and purchased steel in Finland to build icebreakers in Finland that they are going to sell back to the Canadian government. And parts of the ship, don't you worry, are going to be built in Texas to be coming back to the Canadian government. And I just think in my mind, we are a circus. This is a clown show. If you cannot understand that what we have to have is that production inside of this country, I don't see why you should be a federal minister in any way, shape, or form. Military procurement, protecting the coasts, looking after the needs of the Canadian population in that manner, that's the job of the federal government. That's supposed to be the separation of powers. You look after some things, the province looks after some things, the municipality looks after some things. From where I'm sitting, the only thing that the federal government seems to be looking after is themselves and their friends, because they allowed them to take this money and invest it in Texas and invest it in Finland. So it's going into Donald Trump's America, and it's going into Finland, into the Finnish steel industry. And the Canadian steel is not going into this boat at all. So what are we spending our money on it for? And if you say, well, it's the only place they're making it, the question I have is, how come Finland, that has a sliver of the Arctic compared to the amount of Arctic that Canada's looking after, is not being in strict competition with the Canadian shipyard that is building the other 50% of the world's icebreakers. And I would think the first thing that comes to mind is that Finland allows themselves to have the infrastructure built. Canada doesn't, and Canada doesn't have the federal government with the will to put in a deep water port and start to hire people to build these ships so that we are building our own stuff. Because you heard that release from the Davies CEO. They're not talking about building American icebreakers in Finland. They're just saying, oh, they also own that company. Don't worry about it. We're going to turn Galveston, Texas into America's #1 icebreaker builder. Because in America, it's got to be made in America. And in Finland, they want it made in Finland. And in Canada, we seem to want it made in China. We have to start with us. We are the ones, just like you see from the example of the airline strike. When the people say what we want, the government will follow, not the other way around. They do what we want, not the other way around. Now, I get that many people don't understand that concept, and that's why you hear me saying it out loud, because they just siphoned off 3.25 billion Canadian dollars at a time when we could use every nickel we can get our hands on. That's just my opinion. You can let me know what your opinion is down in the comments. I'm going to wrap here. I want to thank you for listening. I'll talk to you next time.